through the pain. Pastor Timms, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
So you're suffering in Orlando, Florida, for the Lord.
Yes,
That's your assignment?
That's our assignment. We have about 70-degree weather here.
Most of the year.
Yeah,
that's right.
One day after another.
Well, I'm Tim with Ed Reva, and we appreciate you being on our program. Your book is called When It All Falls Apart, Finding Healing, Joy, and Victory Through the Pain. Tell us, let's get started here. We've got about 20 minutes with you. What do you tell our listeners? Let's get started. What is your story?
Well, my story, it starts off pretty great, actually. I met my husband in church. I had a testimony that God kept me. I grew up in church, and that's all I knew, the Lord, and walked worthy of the call. And I married my husband, who had not been saved all his life. We get married. We grow up the ranks in our ministry, get sent out by our pastor to Orlando, Florida. And we started off with no members. We started up in a hotel and then moved to a storefront and eventually to our own building. And within 5 to 6 years, we're a mega ministry, and we hit about 8,000 members. And things were going okay until infidelity hit our marriage. A lot of things started to transpire in the ministry, and it all fell apart. And that's when I wrote the book, because sometimes things happen to you when you feel like you're doing everything you're supposed to do. And the book is not just about people who experience infidelity or betrayal. It really deals with anyone who experienced a tragic loss, whether a loved one, maybe a child that dies prematurely, or loss of a business, a home, and even with our economy and things happening, many people have experienced tragic loss. But you never should end up bitter. You should always come out better. When you're walking with the Lord, there has to be an area of your life where you can be empowered and enlightened, and that's what this book is really about. It gives you a process to that. And what makes my story more tragic is that my marriage did not make it. And I was one of the ones that proclaimed from the rooftops, divorce is not an option. And when my marriage failed, it was devastating. And then later, about 2 years later, my ex-husband passes away, and my children now don't have a dad. However, the Lord has been more than amazing, and you can have victory after a horrible tragedy in your life. And that's what the book is about.
Reva, I want to, and of course, the infidelity was on the part of your husband. It was unexpected and devastating, and there were, and I'm not trying to speak ill of him, but there was more than one instance, I think, of infidelity. You were blindsided by it. I want to say about this book, this is much more than just a story about your life. This is a teaching book, and I've gone through it and found that there are many, many powerful, biblically based teaching lessons in this. So I do want to encourage people to get a copy of this book, When It All Falls Apart, because you show how not only biblical principles that are detached from your own story, but these are biblical principles that actually helped you. And they deal with the very real suffering that many Christians go through, because, a lot of Christians grow up thinking, and I think you even express this, if I remember correctly in your book, that if you live a holy life, if you live a devout life, if you obey God to the best of your ability by His grace, good things will happen to you, and the bad things will pass you by. But that's not what you discovered.
No, that isn't. And then, but when you study the Word of God, you notice that all through the Word of God, you see the Josephs. You see those that stood for what was right and still experienced tragedy. You see the Apostle Paul's. You see story after story of those that have stood and with the Lord and walked worthy of the call, but yet still experienced trials. And that's kind of where the book goes into. It deals with how do you respond when you lose a loved one? How do you respond when you experience betrayal? And I give you step-by-step ways to. One part we need to understand is when things happen, there is a separation stage, and people get really distraught. I did. I went to depression. I got distraught at the separation stage of losing everything, and I mean everything. But then when you realize the separation stage is just really another stage right before the beginning stage. And that's where your hope comes in. God never leaves you just so that you will flounder. He's always with you. And that's where I think many Christians forget. Though you might be in pain, God is still there with you.
We're talking to Reva Tims, Tims. Her book is When It All Falls Apart, Finding Healing, Joy, and Victory Through the Pain. How do people get a copy of your book, Reva?
They can Facebook or Barnes & Noble, and Barnes & Noble and other Christian bookstores. But if you visit RevaTimsBooks.com, as well as Reva Tims on Facebook and Pastor Reva Tims on Facebook, you get all the information there.
How many children do you have?
I have 4 children, 18, 17, 14, and 13, and I have a special needs, my 17-year-old with special needs.
So, wow. So when did this happen when you discovered your husband was stepping out?
This was 2007 is when I found out that it was true. I always had suspicions, but 2007 is when it really came out that it was actually true.
I don't want to get, I'm not trying to be sensational here, but I'm just curious, when you say suspicions, what do you mean?
Well, every woman knows when their husband is something's not right.
Right.
You just know. And I just knew something wasn't right. Again, we experienced tremendous success in ministry, but our home was changed. The atmosphere had changed. And so I kept asking him questions, but it came out. I actually was able to speak with one of his mistresses, and it was confirmed.
Yeah. How did you deal with that with the kids?
Well, we believe that truth is the most important thing for kids, especially in the era that we're in with technology and Facebook. And I never wanted them to hear anything via someone else. So I set them down, and my husband at the time, he sat with us, and we talked to them and let them know what was going on. And throughout the entire process, we just kept them alert and aware of what was happening, so they would be covered.
You mean he was there when you had to tell him that he was cheating on you?
Yeah, if anybody who's listening is going through a divorce or any type of anxiety, it's never good to take sides for children. That is still the parent as well, and they need to feel that both parents are there for them, and that's what we did. We went to them as mommy and daddy.
Gotcha.
Even though mommy and daddy were not happy at the time, we were still mommy and daddy 100% for them. And we both told them what was happening, not sordid details, but we did tell them what happened.
Talking to Reva Tims, Tims. What's your website, Reva?
MajesticLifeChurch.com.
MajesticLifeChurch.com. She lives in Orlando, Florida. Ed?
Reva, of course, that's extraordinary what you just shared about how you approached your children with it. One of the other extraordinary things about the story, and you just alluded to it just a moment ago, is that you actually called the woman who had been having an affair with your husband for 14 months, and you called her to confront her, and she was actually angry at your husband because he was breaking it off with her. And I just thought it was, and this is just a testimony to God's faithfulness, because you share how much you failed, I say failed, how weak you were and how difficult this was in your story, but how faithful God was. In the course of that phone conversation with this woman, you actually found yourself having compassion on this woman, and you shared the gospel with her. I just thought that was the most extraordinary thing. Why don't you, would you share a little bit about how God helped you do that?
My purpose for calling her was she was going to the media. She was sending so many things out. Again, it was my children I was concerned with, and I got her number and I called her, and I wanted her to stop for my family's sake. And I began to talk to her, and I realized she knew nothing of the Lord, knew nothing of the principles of the word, and she was very distraught. They had a 14-month relationship, and I'm here with a 14-year marriage. And so talking with her, I realized she was ignorant, although she knew it was wrong. But I began to tell her, this is not how men of God behave. This is not how the church behaves. And from this point on, after I administer the gospel of Jesus Christ to you, you will be accountable to what you do. And I explained to her the love of Jesus will cover her sins. And she, at that point, I could feel her breaking, even on the phone when we were talking on the phone. And that can only happen, I'm telling you, for me to do that can only happen by the grace of God, by the Spirit of the Lord.
Wow. Talking to Pastor Reva Timms from Orlando, Florida. And, like you said earlier in the interview, Reva, your story, is applicable to, and then the advice you give and the scriptural admonitions you give are applicable in all kinds of losses. That's what you're talking about. In this case, you lost your marriage, but people, lose their
their business,
or their home, or their relationships with
sometimes
friends,
with children,
or whatever. So it's just there are pains and losses, and a lot of times it's unexpected.
Right.
Yeah. And people oftentimes want to either play the blame game. I was me. I was like, it's his fault. If he hadn't done this would have happened. And then I had to get, in one of the chapters in my book, talks about you have to take a look inside. And you have to begin to look at what could you have done better. You begin to look at, even though you weren't the one that caused it to happen, but there's always things that we could have done better. You have to look at there areas in our lives that we can always change. And that it puts you in a whole different perspective. You look at talents that you may have hidden. You look at inside hidden sins that might be there. And when people have tragic loss, oftentimes they run to fill that void. They run to a woman, they run to a man, they get in terrible relationships that are not of God, rebounding, or they run to substance abuse because they're trying to feel that rejection, that hurt. And I talk in the book on how to maneuver through that because it happens. And I think sometimes we can talk as believers and just say, hey, have faith, believe. But how do I believe? How do I walk through it is the question.
One of the things that you discuss in the book is the importance of how church people around you react. Some of them didn't react too well, but share, if you will, with our listeners and those watching. You tell a very interesting story about how you were invited, and I think this was a number of months or even a year or so after the discovery of what was happening and your marriage began to melt down. You were invited to speak at a church anniversary, and explain, if you would, about how, as the story unfolds, eventually you are actually ministered to by people from your church.
Yes. Well, I was, as you said, I was preaching at a person's anniversary. One of the members that we actually sent out to pastor, and they invited me. I hadn't been speaking much at all. And when I got up to minister, I saw faces from the church that I had previous pastored. I saw faces that I hadn't seen in about a year or two, and I got stunned, I guess, and I couldn't go any further. And I felt so embarrassed because I felt like now I really look like a fool, And I just said, I'm sorry, and I walked down from the pulpit, and I walked straight out the back door, got in the car, and the person who was driving me, I said, what could I have done? And she said, you could have stayed. And so I had her turn the car around and went back in, and to my surprise, they were all praying on the pulpit. And these are all sons and daughters in ministry praying, and they said, Pastor Reva, we're so sorry. They said, this happened about almost 2 years ago. Our lives have gone on, but yours haven't. And we didn't cover you. We didn't pray for you. And at that moment, I realized there are times when you have to look fear right in its face. You have to look humility right in its face. And had I gone home and never turned back around, I don't think I would have even moved further in my ministry and my walk with the Lord as I have now. But because I made a decision to look it in the face. And that's what we have to do when we lose things, when we find ourselves in humiliated places. That's not for us to give up. That's a time when we still have to press forward. We still have an assignment from God. And that's what he spoke to me. I honestly had never really believed in being a female single pastor. That's just never been in my thoughts. It's not something that I did not want. But the Lord spoke to me, and he said, when I called you before you were even thought of in your mother's womb, you had an assignment. and you have to have that assignment finished. Your assignment is